Our final presenter for this session is Dr. Lynne Lewis, who is an Associate Professor of Economics at Bates College in Maine. Much of her research has addressed transboundary water resource management. In her talk, Dr. Lewis will discuss the history and economics of water sharing in the Southwestern United States. She will highlight disputes over water sharing agreements and explore how we can apply the lessons learned from these disagreements and their resolutions to other regions of the United States. Dr. Lewis?
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed all the talks I've heard, and thank you to Aaron, I think, for a hard act to follow. That was just fabulous. But we just heard about some tensions in international river basins, and I want to talk about some tensions in interstate river basins, particularly in the western U.S., but some in the eastern U.S., to think about some of the lessons learned. We heard a lot yesterday about western water issues, which I think may have made my job a little bit easier. I hope you have some of those pictures in your head. When I moved from Colorado to New England, in particular, first to New Haven and then to Maine, it was like moving to the moon. I mean, it's just a very, very different place, very different attitudes about water, and there's a lot of it. I mean, look at the weather we've been having. In Colorado, when it rains for a full day, gosh, when it's cloudy for a full day, people get really agitated and really irritated, and imagine a bunch of Coloradans walking around with umbrellas. It's a scary, it's dangerous. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to talk about some western water issues. I'm going to talk about some basic economic hydrology, as I like to call it. And then I'm going to talk about how we allocate water across state lines. We heard some about that yesterday. Talk about some disputes with those rules. And I'll give you the punchline right away on some things that I think we need. I think we need flexibility. I think we need to carefully consider interdisciplinary and watershed-based solutions. We need to integrate water quality and water quantity. We need to integrate thinking about groundwater and surface water. We need in-stream flow protection. We need to appropriately price water, and that includes putting implicit prices on ecological values, because ecological damage is economic damage. And so those are some of the things I'm going to hint at in my talk. In the western states, we heard some about water law yesterday. I don't need to go into this, but both systems of riparian doctrine and prior appropriation doctrine in the west face pressures. Both quantity and quality pressures are increasing. And eastern states, we just heard this morning, the riparian doctrine and some of our laws aren't adequate to really respond to some of the new issues. So what can we learn from the western United States? In the west, you know, some of the conflicts we've resolved, some of them we haven't, but I think we've got some valuable lessons. So it's Saturday morning. I thought we'd start with a quiz. Water flow uphill or downhill? How many think uphill? Couple hands. How many think downhill? Okay. Saturday morning quizzes are easy. You're all correct. Water flows in whatever direction we want it to, apparently. Where the money goes, the water flows. So let's show some pictures of that happening. In the Lower Basin of the Colorado River, we've got a project called the Central Arizona Project that carries Arizona's share of that compact. We heard about the compact yesterday, from Lake Havasu all the way down to the Tohono O'odham Reservation south of Tucson. So this project, the water travels 350 miles. There are 14 pumping plants, 1 pumping generation plant, 10 siphons, some really big washes, 3 tunnels, 45 turnouts, and the water travels over 3,000 vertical feet uphill to get to Phoenix and Tucson. So here's the project as it was envisioned in 1963. So you can see the aqueducts and the channels taking that water from the Colorado River to growing cities in Phoenix and Tucson. And here it is, the water snaking across the desert. This is the most bizarre thing you've ever seen if you're from a wet climate. Another picture of a canal traveling through the desert. And another picture as it's heading into Phoenix and Tucson. And partially because of the salinity content of the Colorado River, The Colorado River leaches salts out of the soils with some very intensive agriculture in western Colorado. By the time it gets to the lower basin, it's quite salty. And Tucson residents, very spoiled with their pristine groundwater that's heavily overdrafted, rejected this water as drinking water. And right now, this very expensive water that's flowing into Tucson is now being pumped back underground to mix with the groundwater there on the Tohono O'odham Reservation. And hopefully, well, we'll see. Stay tuned on whether the mixed water is more palatable. So there's a very expensive project. Another one, we heard a little bit about this yesterday. We talked about the South Platte River in Ellen's great talk yesterday morning. So there's a project that takes water. Now this is fabulous. This project takes water from the western slope of Colorado through the Rocky Mountains and into the South Platte River. So you've got Shadow Mountain Reservoir, water's pumped uphill and then goes through a tunnel underneath the Rocky Mountains, Rocky Mountain National Park, and out the other side, and eventually into the South Platte River, adds a potential of 310,000 acre feet each year. This is the West Slope collection system, so this is all of the infrastructure on the western slope before it goes through the Alva B. Adams Tunnel. This is that pumping station, and it flows by gravity. This is the Granby Dam spillway, a more recent picture of the Granby Dam spillway. This is a topo map, so you can see the elevation gains and losses that this water goes through. The eastern portal of the tunnel. The East Slope distribution system. Talk about infrastructure. We've had a lot of talk about infrastructure yesterday. This is 12 reservoirs, 35 miles of tunnels, 95 miles of canals, and 7,000 miles of transmission lines. Eastern portal, and again flowing into Mary's Lake. And we heard about the South Platte River system yesterday. Originally, shares of this water sold for $1.50. And we're going to talk in a little bit about what they sell for now, but this is a very, very expensive federally financed project, only partially financed by the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, and some pretty cheap original shares. And then yesterday we heard about interlinking of Indian rivers, a $200 million project. So again, water flows in whatever direction the money's coming from, it seems. So, what are some of the interstate allocation rules that have allowed this to happen, or some of these things to happen? I want to talk about interstate compacts in particular. We heard yesterday about the doctrine of equitable apportionment that gave rise to some of these interstate compacts. And an interstate compact is negotiated by the states riparian to the interstate river, and once ratified by Congress, it becomes a federal law. So any disputes with the compact must be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. And there are 22 compacts in the western U.S. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the earliest, the Colorado River Compact, but there are quite a few compacts that allocate water across state lines. The Colorado River Compact, we did hear about this yesterday, divides the river in half at Lee's Ferry. The lower basin states are Arizona, California, and Nevada, and the upper basin states of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. There's a sliver of Arizona that's actually in the upper basin here, but this is a watershed boundary. You know, water moves, it doesn't pay attention to our state lines very well, and so here's a management system that divides water by states, but with little attention to the watershed boundaries. So this shows you some of the projects and the states there. And this, some of the large cities in the lower basin. Now this is the more rapidly growing region, higher demands for water thus far. Now the compact is very interesting because, I will quote, compact apportions beneficial consumptive use of 7.5 million acre feet of water per annum to the upper and lower basins. So that sounds pretty reasonable. But the way the compact was written was a little bit different. There's this piece, but then there's a specific rule within the compact that says that the lower basin is to receive an average of 75 million acre feet per 10-year period. So on average of 7.5 million acre feet per year to the lower basin. The upper basin must deliver that. There's no actual allocation for the upper basin. The idea when this compact was signed was that there's about 17 million acre feet in the river, we'll split it in half, we'll leave some from Mexico, everyone will be happy. Well, as Peter told us yesterday, we have to be very careful about making allocation rules or any kind of rules based on past climate or past science. There were some very wet flow years that led to this assumption that flows might be that high. In actuality, they're not. And so the compact requirement to deliver water to the lower basin gives all the risk to the upper basin. They only get what's left. And so the upper basin states got a little panicky, signed their own compact with a very different allocation rule, one that allows risk sharing across the states, more equitable risk sharing. And so the upper basin compact allocates by a percentage rule. Colorado gets the majority of that water, but each state gets a percentage. The sliver in Arizona gets a fixed proportion. But these are the typical allocation rules of these interstate compacts. It's either some sort of fixed rule, some sort of percentage rule, or some combination. I've done some work on the economic efficiency of these types of rules, but the risk-sharing piece is pretty important. And actually, the law of the river is more complicated than just two interstate compacts. There are quite a few legal agreements that govern water allocation, including a treaty with Mexico with a requirement to deliver 1.5 million acre feet. We forgot to pay attention to how salty that water was at one point. The Mexican government sued the U.S. government for delivering water saltier than the ocean. Lots of crop damages that are, economic damages, pretty significant. And so there's a series of rules that govern this river system, and it's pretty complex. The lower basin, based on another agreement, gets an allocation of almost 4.5 million acre feet for California, 2.8 million acre feet for Arizona. Nevada gets a skimpy 300,000 acre feet. They're not happy about that. Arizona is finally able to, with its Central Arizona project that I showed you pictures of, to draw on its share of its allocation. So there's stressors in that there's some infrastructure that's bringing the water to these places now, but this is a fast-growing region. There have been extreme droughts, and now with climate change adding future uncertainty, it's not clear what will happen with this compact. And as we heard yesterday, there is talk of renegotiation of this compact. And that's difficult because all the parties have to unanimously agree on a new allocation. Okay. Have the compacts succeeded in preventing conflicts? Sometimes. There's been some pretty interesting cases where they haven't. Now remember, if there's a dispute, the Supreme Court hears it. Texas versus New Mexico on the Pecos River in 1987 over compact violations. Kansas versus Colorado in 1995 over violations of the Arkansas River Compact. Kansas versus Nebraska and Colorado in 2002 over the Republican River Compact have been some of the notable controversies. I want to talk about the Arkansas River for a minute. Now, here's the case. When one side of the border calls the river the Arkansas and the other side of the border calls the river the Arkansas, you know there's going to be some issues. So, what's the history there? The Kansas versus Colorado case in 1907 set the stage for the Interstate Compact. I believe we heard about this yesterday. The Supreme Court ruled that just because a river originates in your state doesn't mean you get to use it all up. Not their words, but essentially that was the gist of it. And in 1943, there was another suit over this river, and at this point the Supreme Court said, you guys, you might want to negotiate a compact. So they did, and the purpose of the compact is to settle existing disputes and prevent future controversies, and to equitably apportion the Arkansas River at John Martin Dam, with releases from John Martin Dam. Well, lo and behold, another lawsuit in 1985. What happened? The compact clearly failed. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1995 that Colorado had violated the compact by 320,000 plus acre feet. Kansas originally claimed $320 million in damages. At the time, I was on the faculty of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and I worked with a student on thinking about the impacts of damages to Kansas, and we looked at some of the agricultural values in that region. What was being grown with that water on both sides of the border was primarily sorghum, soybeans, onions, and melons, not high-valued crops. Best we could come up with was $29.4 million, so we figured we must have done something wrong. And Kansas lowered the amount they were arguing for in 01 to $60 million, $53 million in 2002. New rulings asked for $29 million. And recently, Colorado finally paid, now this is a long, drawn-out lawsuit, $34 million in damages for the period of 1950 to 1999. So, you know, the incentives are there to violate the compact if it's going to take this many years to receive any sort of payment. So how did this happen? Well, here's lesson number 2. Lesson number 1 was on the Colorado River. Lesson number 2, Colorado did not intentionally violate the compact, but the state of Colorado authorized well drilling for farmers in this region. Now, the soils in this region are incredibly porous, and so what was happening was you take water up from a well, it's coming right out of the river, everything's interconnected. The compact doesn't deal with groundwater, so Colorado was not intentionally violating the compact, but what had to happen was a moratorium on well building. There's now a very sophisticated hydrologic model that examines the interactions between pumping from wells and river flows. And so it takes some good science to put this all back together. And the conjunctive use piece is very important. Allocation rules need to consider both surface water and groundwater. And there have been traditionally many states in the West that either haven't had groundwater rules at all or rules very separate from surface water. So that's an important lesson, I think. Okay, what does the economics say? What else does the economics say? Economics says water should flow to its highest valued use at the margin. And I think that use should include non-use or in-stream flow. Some of our allocation rules only deal with beneficial consumptive use. So we need to think about how to incorporate that. Does water flow to its highest valued use? Well, again, in some cases, yes. In most cases, no. But there are some examples. In the West, states have not allowed interstate water sales. This is hugely controversial. Not something I'll talk about today, but it is an interesting subject. But there are some examples of some very successful statewide water markets. So one of them is Water Colorado. You can go to this website. This is like the Craigslist for water sales. So you can click on buy, rent, or sell water to see who's buying and selling. And if you do that, you'll get a screen that looks like this because, you know, where are you? Where do you want to buy it? Because you've got to get water that you can transport to where you're going. So if you click on the South Platte River Basin, where we just were, a screen will come up like this, and you'll see shares of water, and you'll see prices, how many shares, where it's coming from, what kind of water it is. And if you click on one of these, you might get a picture that looks like this, 10 units of Colorado Big Thompson water. Remember, this is the water that's coming from the Colorado River all the way through the Rocky Mountains into the South Platte River. Original shares sold for $1.50. This is $10,700 per share. That's pretty average right now. Shares were going for less than $100 in the 70s, have risen over time. There have been many transfers of CBT water and South Platte River water, mostly from ag to cities, some leases, some purchases. So water is moving around, and there's the infrastructure to take it there. What we're not seeing is water necessarily moving to environmental uses, although that's starting to happen in some places too. And we heard about that some yesterday. So that's good news. Whether we can put a price on that soon or not will be important. Okay, what about the eastern states? The water disputes, as we've heard, have been moving east. Eastern states are finding the doctrines and the laws inadequate to deal with shortages. So what can we learn from the West? The old law of the river, is it yielding a new law of the river? Are we recognizing environmental values? Something to think about. So have we used compacts in the East? Yeah, we have. We've used them for flood control. So there are a series of compacts dealing with flood control, the Connecticut River Valley Flood Control Compact, the Delaware River Basin Compact, Great Lakes Basin Compact, Potomac Valley Compact, Susquehanna River Basin Compact, Thames River Flood Control Compact, Wheeling Creek Watershed Project and Flood Control Prevention Compact. So we've used these for flood control. We've used them for water pollution control. We've got your own New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Compact, New Hampshire, Vermont Interstate Sewage Waste Disposal Facilities, and there's a bunch of these. And the Tennessee River Basin Water Pollution Control Compact. But only recently have we started to think about interstate water apportionment in the East using the Interstate Compact. So I challenge you to say these 5 times fast as soon as I'm done. Alabama Coosa Tallapoosa River Basin Compact, the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint River Basin Compact, And we can all say the Connecticut River Compacts. You don't need to practice that one. I want to talk about the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint River Basin Compact because it's a really interesting story of how we've failed. Here's the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint River Basin running through Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. Now, what are our controversies here? Our controversy is really between urban use, human use, and ecological use in the Apalachicola Bay. So you've got 3 different river systems flowing through 3 different states, and Atlanta rapidly growing, Lake Lanier shrinking with extreme drought, Apalachicola Bay and some of the conservation values desperate for water. So the states agreed to enter compact negotiations in 1997, and in 2003 the compact expired. The states never came to an agreement on how to allocate that water. It was very controversial. States tried very hard to come to an agreement, and that compact actually failed. So the courts are apportioning interstate water and interstate fish, but not interstate ecological values. Consumptive uses have value. We drink it, we use it for irrigation, we use it for industry, but water left in the river is also very valuable. So we've got to figure out how to apportion that water as well. And to quote J. Rule, riparian habitat isn't riparian if there's no water in the river, and perhaps if we priced that water appropriately, we wouldn't be in this situation. And to quote J. Rule again, the controversy over ACF may signal the end of water abundance in the East and the beginning of intensified competition and conflict between eastern states over interstate waters. The western states model is not particularly friendly to the position that natural flows must be maintained on behalf of ecological values at the expense of commodity values. So my question to you is, will the Supreme Court modernize its doctrine of equitable apportionment? Well, we have to stay tuned for that. So again, some potential solutions to some of these conflicts involve water marketing and banking, conjunctive use management, flexibility in our rules, good science, watershed level management, in-stream flow protection, recognition in our legal agreements of economic and in economic analysis of ecological value. We need interdisciplinary solutions, and we need appropriate pricing. And I will just leave you with a picture of my Bates class on a trip to Hoover Dam. Class I called Valuing the Environment. I taught with an environmental philosopher. So we dealt with economics and ethics, and then I taught it again with an ecologist, and we called it Valuing Human-Altered Ecosystems. Thank you very much.